My dear friends, welcome back to Cinema Vault. It's always a joy to see this space filled with people who don't just watch movies, but inhabit them, wander through their landscapes, taste the air of their worlds, and feel the weight of their silences. You, my fellow literature enthusiasts, understand that cinema, like the best of novels or poems, is more than just a story told. It's a shared emotional geography. Tonight, we're stepping into a story I've been waiting to talk about for months, Mufasa, The Lion King 2025. But before we dive in, let me gently remind you, if this conversation stirs something in you, if you find yourself seeing movies in new colors because of our time together, do click that like button, subscribe, and keep the conversation alive. And please note, this isn't a review in the usual sense. There are no scores or verdicts here. This is a deeply intellectual, theoretical exploration, one crafted for those who savor the intersection between cinema, literature, and the human heart. I want to be honest with you. My relationship with the Lion King mythology runs deep. The original film was one of the first stories that taught me the paradox of beauty and grief living side by side. As a child, I didn't have a vocabulary to articulate what I felt, but I knew something in it had shifted me forever. That's the strange thing about formative art. It plants seeds you only recognize years later. So, walking into this prequel felt less like going to theater and more like being invited to hear a family story, one whispered by an older relative who's finally ready to tell you what really happened. There's a different weight to that. You feel it in your chest before a single frame lights the screen. The opening sequence carried a familiar rhythm. The slow build of music, the sweep of sun over a land so impossibly golden it feels half remembered, half imagined. But here, the tone is different. It's not about the triumph of a kingdom, but about the ache of its beginnings. I found myself leaning forward, realizing this wasn't going to be the grand parade of nostalgia I half expected. It was going to dig into the soil, sometimes literally, and unearth roots we'd only ever glimpsed in shadows. And I felt an odd thrill in that, almost like hearing that a beloved poem had a lost stanza, one that changed the meaning of the whole. As the story unfolds, we meet a younger version of the figure, whose very name has been a mixture of reverence and mystery in the original saga. This isn't the calm, regal presence we've known. This is someone still raw around the edges, unsure of the path ahead, sometimes stumbling, sometimes fierce, often both in the same breath. What caught me most was how unpolished he was. Not in a way that diminished him, but in a way that made him startlingly human, or perhaps startlingly alive in a way we'd never been allowed to see. The early scenes weave between moments of wonder and moments of stark survival. There's a sequence with him and his first true friend, an unlikely ally whose loyalty will come to define much of what follows. That struck me deeply, not because of the obvious beats of camaraderie or shared danger, but because of the quiet in-between gestures, the way they talk when they're not on the run, when there's no immediate threat to outrun or outfight. That's what humanity breathes through. Their jokes, their unspoken fears, their glances at the horizon as if searching for something unnamed. It's that rhythm of small and large moments that builds a real life, and I felt it here in a way most animated epics never risk. And then, without warning, the tone shifts. A betrayal. Not the climactic kind that comes with a booming score and slow motion, but the kind that happens almost silently, under the skin of things. I felt my breath hitch, because it reminded me of real-life betrayals. How they don't announce themselves, how they're only fully understood when the dust settles, and by then the damage is already bone deep. This, I think, is where the movie shows its literary backbone. It understands that the deepest wounds aren't always physical, and they aren't always loud. Yet, for all its shadows, there's an undeniable sense of wonder woven through. There's a moment at the edge of a watering hole at dusk, the air full of insects and the sky awash in colors so layered you almost can't tell where one ends and the other begins. I was struck, sitting there, by the realization that these scenes aren't just establishing shots, they're emotional punctuation. The film uses its landscapes not as a backdrop, but as a mirror, reflecting the character's inner weather. That's a technique I've seen in literature more than film, and it works here with almost unnerving precision. I can't tell you every twist, because part of the power lies in how they sneak up on you, but I will say this. The heart of the story isn't what I thought it would be. It's not about how a king rises to power, nor solely about the hardships that forge him. It's about the people, yes, I'll call them people, because every character here is more than their form, who shape his sense of self, sometimes in love, sometimes in opposition. The friendships, the rivalries, the kinships both chosen and inherited, all form this intricate web where every thread matters. Pull one, and you see the whole thing tremble. There's a certain scene, no spoilers, but you'll know it when you see it, where everything seems to still for just a heartbeat. The air grows heavy, as if the land itself is holding its breath. And what's said in that moment will ripple forward into every decision that follows. That's where I felt the weight of myth pressing in, not in the grandeur of a coronation, but in the intimacy of a conversation under stars older than memory. And that's the thing about this story. It invites you to listen more than to watch. The visuals are stunning, yes, and the pacing keeps you moving, but the real magic is in the spaces between, the silences that say as much as the words, the looks that carry whole histories. You feel the pulse of the land, the rhythm of lives passing through it, and you begin to understand that this isn't a straightforward path from obscurity to legend. It's a tangle of choices, compromises, and moments of grace that shape a soul. By the time the first major turn comes, a shift that redefines alliances and forces our young leader to face truths he's been avoiding, you realize this isn't just a film about power or destiny. It's about identity, about the sometimes painful process of reconciling who you are with who the world believes you should be. And in that, I think, lies its greatest resonance. We've all stood at that crossroads in one way or another. We've all had to decide which voice to follow, the one inside us or the one outside. When the final moments of this part of the journey arrive, there's no false sense of resolution. There's triumph, yes, but it's tinged with the awareness that the road ahead is long and uncertain. And maybe that's why it stays with you. It doesn't try to close the book neatly. It leaves a page unturned, a question lingering. And that's where I'll leave you tonight. We've only skimmed the surface, and yet you can already feel the currents pulling deeper. The rest, as always, you'll have to experience for yourself. Not for the plot beats or the spectacle alone, but for the quiet truths woven into the frame. The first thing you feel is the air. It's not just warm, it's alive. It hums with a faint, buzzing chorus of unseen insects, carries a mineral tang of freshly turned soil, and moves a way that makes the tall grasses sway like they're breathing. Somewhere far in the distance, the sun is only just beginning to rise, laying thin golden threads across the dark purple fabric of the receding night. And through this quiet, you hear something, faint at first, almost like a drumbeat in your own chest, but growing. Footsteps, careful, deliberate, and yet hesitant. That's him, younger than the name that will one day carry such weight could ever suggest. His mane is barely there, more a crown of rough edges than a polished symbol of rule, and his eyes, while sharp, still have that restless flicker that belongs to someone searching for where they belong. He's moving slowly, not because he doesn't know where he's going, but because he isn't sure he should be going there at all. That's how the journey begins, not with a roar, but with uncertainty. From the very start, the land feels like a character in its own right. Hills roll away in every direction, dotted with acacia trees that stand like ancient sentinels. Small herds move in the distance, zebra, antelope, creatures that glance up briefly when they hear him, then return to grazing. The stillness is deceptive, though. Beneath the calm is a tension you can feel in your bones. You sense, almost instinctively, that this place remembers things. Old struggles, old alliances. It's a living memory, and he's walking through it like someone paging through a history book written in dust and grass. We meet his companion before we even understand the shape of his journey, a wiry, quick-talking figure who seems to have been carved from equal parts charm and mischief. They trade barbs as they walk, but there's an undercurrent of trust in the way they move around each other. You get the feeling they've been in tight spots before, maybe more times than they'd like to admit, and somehow always made it out with their skins intact. This companion has the easy confidence of someone who knows they're useful, but also the dangerous curiosity of someone who can't resist poking at trouble just to see what happens. The first true moment of tension comes when they stumble upon a stretch of land clearly marked by someone or something else's claim. A circle of bones, sun-bleached and sharp, frames a patch of cracked earth. It's a warning, and it's not subtle. His companion suggests detouring around it. He, however, doesn't move. His gaze lingers on the ground, as if he's reading something in the arrangement of those bones that no one else can see. He steps forward. This decision leads to the first real confrontation of the story. Not with a villain in the grand sense, but with the land's lesser predators. Sleek, scarred, and clearly organized, they move in on the two travelers like a pack that's done this 100 times before. The scene is quick, sharp, and breathless. Every movement counts. Every dodge feels like a brush with disaster, and yet it's not brute force that gets him out. It's wit, his companion's quick thinking, and his own instinctive ability to anticipate the pack's movements. You see, in that moment, the seeds of what will one day be called leadership, though right now it's just survival. After this encounter, they push on, but something in him has shifted. He asks questions, not idle ones, but the kind that pull at the fabric of the past. Who marked that land? Why? His companion is evasive, but you can tell they both know more than they're saying. This is one of those story beats where the silence speaks louder than any line of dialogue. They arrive at a settlement of sorts, a cluster of rock formations, serving as home to a small community. It's not a bustling center, but there's life here. The soft calls of mothers to their young, the rhythmic work of repairing shelters, the exchange of goods in low, steady voices. It's here that we meet someone who will become pivotal, a figure who, at first glance, seems to embody stability and authority. But there's a weariness in their eyes, the kind that suggests they've had to hold too much together for too long. Our young traveler approaches them with respect, but also with an unmistakable urgency. They speak in low tones, the kind of conversation that forces you to lean in without realizing you've done it. There's talk of shifting alliances, of resources growing scarce, of tensions that threaten to spill over. He listens, but it's clear he's already thinking 3 steps ahead, piecing together what this could mean for his own unspoken goals. And then there's the matter of a name, one mentioned almost accidentally by someone in the settlement. The moment it's spoken, everything seems to still. His eyes narrow, his posture changes. It's not just a name. It's a tether to something in his past, something unresolved. He doesn't say anything right away, but you can feel the story pulling toward it, like a river drawn to a hidden current. From here, the journey takes a more personal turn. We follow him into the night, away from the settlement, to a place where the stars are thick enough to look like spilled salt. He's alone, and for the first time, we see the weight he carries without the armor of banter or bravado. He murmurs something, perhaps to himself, perhaps to someone who isn't there, and the wind answers a way that feels almost deliberate. By morning, the tones shift again. There's an urgency now, a plan forming. He convinces his companion to follow him into territory neither of them has traveled before, a region whispered about for its dangers, but also for the opportunities it hides. This stretch of the film feels like a tightening spiral. The stakes are rising, the threats more pronounced, but so are the glimpses of what he's capable of when cornered. One of the most striking sequences comes when they cross a dried riverbed. Its cracked surface a mosaic of loss. The light is harsh, shadows sharp, and the emptiness feels almost oppressive. And yet, in the midst of this desolation, they find signs of life, a single stubborn plant forcing its way through the stone, a faint trail of water leading to somewhere unseen. It's symbolic, of course, but it's also practical. Follow the water, and maybe they'll find what they're searching for. Their path is interrupted by a meeting with another traveler, one whose presence feels both like an accident and an inevitability. This newcomer has information, partial, cryptic, and tinged with warning. They speak of a figure who's been gathering influence, reshaping the balance of power in ways that could either unite or destroy everything. You can see in our protagonist's face that this name, too, means something. Pieces are falling into place, though the picture they're forming is still incomplete. The encounters that follow are layered with tension, some physical, as they fend off threats from predators both animal and political, some emotional, as old wounds are hinted at but never fully explained. Each step forward seems to bring them closer, not just to a goal, but to a reckoning. And then, just when it feels like they're finally gaining ground, they're caught in a moment that changes the tempo of the entire story. It's not a grand battle or a sweeping revelation. It's something smaller, quieter, A realization that the people they're moving among are not just pawns of a larger game, but lives, real, fragile, and in many ways, depending on the choices he's about to make. The last scenes in the stretch carry a subtle but unmistakable shift. He's no longer just navigating for himself. There's a responsibility now, an awareness that whatever he's chasing isn't just about him. But alongside that awareness is a shadow, the growing certainty that to protect what matters, he might have to confront not just enemies, but the part of himself he's tried hardest to outrun. The wind changes before anything else does. It starts subtle, a shift in its direction, a faint coolness to the air, but he feels it. It ripples through him like an instinct sharpened by countless days in the wild. The grasses that had moved lazily in the sun now bend differently, like they've heard something approaching long before it arrives. And then comes a sound, not loud, not yet, but layered, the low, distant rumble of many feet. They are no longer alone in this journey, though not in the way one will hope. Shapes begin to form along the horizon, and with them, a tension that clings like humidity. These aren't the curious wanderers they've met before, nor the small packs of predators that could be outwitted with quick thinking. These are organized, determined, moving with the precision of a force that knows exactly what it wants and how to take it. His companion senses it too. Their usual humor is gone, replaced with the clipped efficiency of someone who's preparing for the worst. Words between them are minimal now, not because there's nothing to say, but because saying it would make it real. They quicken their pace. The dry earth cracks beneath their feet. The trail of water they've been following now feels like it's leading them into something much larger than either of them anticipated. And then, almost as if the land itself decides to intervene, they find themselves at the edge of a gorge. The drop is steep, the river at its bottom, rushing with a force that makes the air vibrate. The only way across is an ancient stone bridge, crumbling in places, its surface etched with patterns that seem almost deliberate. He studies it, fingers tracing the grooves, and for a fleeting moment, it's as though the bridge is speaking to him, reminding him of stories half forgotten, of warnings given long before he walked this path. Crossing it is a gamble. One wrong step, and the current below will swallow them whole. But staying where they are is not an option. As they move across, stones shift underfoot, sending shards of rock tumbling into the water. Midway through, a shadow passes overhead. It's not a cloud. It's alive, vast, and circling. They press forward, reaching the other side just as the shadow dives, the rush of wind from its wings nearly knocking them off their feet. They don't speak of it once they've made it across, but the encounter leaves a mark. He can feel it in the way his heart won't settle, in the way his eyes scan the sky now as often as the ground. Whatever game he thought he was playing, the board is much bigger, and the other players far more dangerous than he'd realized. Not long after, they reach a place unlike any they've seen so far. It's an oasis, lush and improbably green, hidden away behind a curtain of jagged cliffs. The water here is still, glassy, reflecting the towering palms above. The air is thick with the scent of flowers and ripe fruit, a strange contrast to the barren stretches they've crossed. But the beauty of it feels staged, controlled, as if it's meant to lure, not welcome. They meet someone here, a figure whose calm presence is disarming, whose words are as polished as the surface of the water. This is not an ally, though the conversation that follows is draped in courtesy. They speak in riddles, offering pieces of information that could be helpful or could just as easily be traps. His companion shifts uneasily beside him, catching the edges of threats hidden in the silken tone. The moment they step away from the oasis, they know they've been marked. Whether it's for protection or for pursuit, they can't yet tell. But there's no going back. The road ahead is already shaping into something irreversible. Their path leads them toward the place where all the threads of his journey have been pointing, even if he didn't realize it first. Along the way, they pass through land scarred by fire, where the ground is blackened and brittle. The silence here is suffocating, broken only by the occasional crack of ash beneath their feet. It's in this place that the first real ghost of his past appears. Not a literal one, but memory so vivid it might as well be standing before him. Words spoken long ago echo in his mind, heavy with accusation and promise alike. This memory fuels him now. His stride lengthens, his voice grows sharper, his decisions faster. His companion notices a change, tries to ask where it's coming from, but he brushes it off. There's no time to explain, and perhaps no way to explain without reopening wounds that never truly healed. When they finally arrive at the heart of this looming conflict, it's nothing like he imagined. The place is not a grand citadel or a seat of obvious power. It's quiet, unassuming, built into the land itself, hidden in plain sight. But beneath that quiet lies movement, plans in motion, figures coming and going with purpose. He steps inside, and the air changes again. It's cooler here, heavier. He's led through winding passages to a chamber where the figure at the center of all this waits. The moment their eyes meet, the room feels smaller. There's recognition there, mutual, undeniable. The conversation that follows is measured, but every sentence is a blade. Words are chosen with precision, each one cutting away at the distance between them until the truth, raw and unavoidable, is laid bare. The revelation is not a simple one. It's tangled in years of choices, in betrayals both real and perceived, in a chain of events that have shaped the land and its people far more than he ever understood. And at its core is something deeply personal, something that ties him to this figure not just as adversary, but as reflection. This is where the pace quickens. Decisions made in this chamber set off a chain reaction. Alliances shift in hours. Places that felt safe burn. Friends become enemies, and enemies reveal themselves as unlikely allies. The land itself seems to react. Storms rolling in, rivers swelling, animals moving in strange patterns as if sensing the shift in balance. The climax builds not in a single moment, but in a series of escalating confrontations. One is fought with claws and teeth, raw and desperate. Another with nothing but words, yet no less dangerous. Each encounter strips away another layer of who he thought he was, and forces him to face who he has to become. When the final confrontation comes, it's not about winning in the traditional sense. It's about choice, about what kind of legacy he's willing to claim, and what he's willing to sacrifice to protect it. The fight is fierce, but it's the silence afterward that lingers. The kind of silence that only comes when something is truly ended. In the resolution, there is no sweeping celebration. The land is still scarred, the work still ahead. But there's a shift, a sense that the tide, for now, has turned in the right direction. He stands where the journey began, the wind moving through the grass once more. This time, though, it carries something different. Not uncertainty, but resolve. His companions stand beside him, looking out at the horizon. There's a faint smile there, not of triumph, but of shared survival. They've made it this far. The rest will come. And in that final moment, as the sun dips low and the shadows stretch long, he understands that the story he thought he was living was only ever the beginning of something much greater. The past is still with him, but so is the future, and for the first time, he feels ready to face both. He moves like someone who has carried the weight of memory for too long, not a visible heaviness. There's no stoop in his back, no limp in his step, but it's there, in the way his gaze sometimes lingers on nothing, in the subtle tightening of his jaw when certain names are spoken. His strength is undeniable, but it's not the kind that comes from raw force alone. It's the tempered kind, the kind you get from walking through loss and coming out the other side, still standing, though never quite the same. At first glance, he's the leader because he has to be. The land needs one. The companions around him need one, and whether or not he feels ready, he carries that role. But what makes him compelling isn't the mantle of leadership. It's how human he feels beneath it. There's doubt in him, sometimes crippling. Yet he never lets it stop his forward motion. His decisions aren't flawless. And when they go wrong, the guilt doesn't just fade. It burrows in, reshaping him in ways both painful and necessary. This is a figure built on contrasts. In one moment, he's fierce and unyielding, a wall against whatever force threatens his world. In another, he's quietly vulnerable, almost fragile when faced with the ghost of his past. That vulnerability is never shown in front of those who would exploit it, but in the rare stillness between battles, it surfaces, sometimes in a way his voice softens, sometimes in a way he turns his back to hide what's in his eyes. There's also a side of him that's deeply observant. He doesn't rush to speak in every conversation. Instead, he listens, watches. He studies not only what's said, but what's left unsaid, the pauses, the hesitations, the flickers of emotion that pass too quickly for most to catch. This attentiveness is what allows him to navigate the tangled webs of alliance and betrayal he finds himself in. It's also why the betrayals cut so deep, because when he trusts, he does so completely, and a fracture of that trust feels like a wound to the bone. His companion, though, is another story entirely. They're quick where he is measured, irreverent where he is solemn. There's a spark in them that refuses to dim, even in the darkest moments. Humor is their weapon, their shield, their way of pushing back against the weight of the world. Some mistake it for carelessness, but he knows better. That spark hides a keen mind, one that calculates just as quickly as it jokes. They see the cracks in situations and in people, and know exactly how to slip through them. The bond between them is one forged in necessity, but solidified in something more enduring. In the beginning, there's friction. They come from different worlds, carry different values, and neither is quick to yield. But shared danger has a way of burning away pretense. And by the time the real trials come, they've learned the rhythms of each other's strengths and flaws. It's not a relationship built on unshakable agreement. It's built on trust that survives disagreement. Then there's the figure they meet in the oasis. On the surface, all charm and composure. Every word delivered with deliberate grace. But beneath that is something serpentine, something coiled and waiting. They are the kind of person who never shows their hand, who smiles with their lips while their mind measures exactly how much of you can be bent or broken before you're useless. There's a magnetic quality to them, one that draws people in even when they know better. It's this duality, welcoming and dangerous, that makes them unforgettable. The antagonist at the story's heart is far from one-dimensional. There's history between them and the protagonist, a tangled chain of events that blurs the line between personal grievance and ideological opposition. They're not the type to roar their defiance. Their danger lies in their ability to turn situations to their favor with precision. They see the world as a chessboard, and every move they make is calculated for long-term advantage. What makes them truly chilling is that, from their perspective, they aren't wrong. Their goals are shaped by a logic that's internally consistent, even if it stands in direct opposition to everything the protagonist believes in. In quieter moments, away from the direct conflict, their intelligence is almost magnetic. Conversations with them can feel like standing on the edge of a cliff, dangerous, exhilarating, and impossible to turn away from. And while they might cloak themselves in control, their flashes brief, almost imperceptible, with a mask slips, revealing the raw, human emotion that fuels their drive. The supporting characters that weave through the journey are more than just ornaments to the story. There's the elder, whose words seem to carry the weight of centuries, whose every gesture feels deliberate, as though they are guiding events toward an end only they can see. There's a young one, full of restless energy, reckless in ways that make the protagonist both wary and protective. And there are the silent ones, the watchers on the periphery, whose presence is felt more than seen, shaping the edges of the path without ever stepping fully into the light. Even the land itself takes on a kind of character. It shifts and responds, its moods mirroring the journey's arc. In the beginning, it's vast and open, full of possibility. As the story deepens, it grows harsher, the terrain becoming treacherous, forcing choices that shape the travelers as much as the conflicts do. By the end, it softens again, not entirely safe, but changed, as if acknowledging the transformation of those who've walked it. What binds all these figures, friend, foe, and the places between, is that they each carry their own truths, their own private convictions. No one here exists purely for someone else's story. Each has a path they believe they're walking for themselves, even when those paths intersect in ways that spark conflict or alliance. For the protagonist, this is the heart of his growth, not simply in defeating an opponent or surviving a trial, but in learning to see those truths in others. It's in recognizing that even the one he opposes most fiercely is shaped by their own history, their own wounds and aspirations. It's an understanding that trust, once broken, can never be made whole in the same way, but something new can grow in its place. And perhaps most importantly, it's in realizing that his journey isn't about returning to who he was before. That person is gone, replaced by someone who has seen too much to remain untouched. The change is entirely comfortable. There's loss in it as well as strength, but it's real. And in the end, That reality is what allows him to step forward into whatever comes next, not as the person he thought he needed to be, but as the one he's become. Some stories about movies are told on the screen. Others, the truly peculiar ones, happen when the cameras aren't rolling. And with this film, those off-camera moments were almost as enchanting and occasionally as bewildering as the finished work itself. There's something almost magical about walking onto a set that's trying to bring a world like this to life. It doesn't matter if it's built on a soundstage or rendered in lines of code. There's an energy to it, a low hum of creativity that seeps into everyone. But in the case of this production, that energy often tilted into the strange, the kind of strangeness that makes you pause and think, is this really happening? One of the first oddities came before the main animation work had even begun. The creative team, wanting to immerse themselves in the emotional tone of the story, decided to take a research retreat in a wildlife reserve, not for practical animal observation alone, but to live for a week under conditions inspired by the story setting. This meant sleeping in tents that looked suspiciously like something from a fantasy illustrator's sketchbook, eating meals cooked over open fires, and holding production meetings in a circle around a lantern. It might sound gimmicky, but by the end of it, the animators were telling stories to each other in the same rhythm and cadence as the characters they would later bring to life. Some swore that when they got back to their desks, their pencils, or rather, their styluses, moved differently, as if infused with that shared experience. Then there was a voice swap incident, which became legendary among the crew. One recording session had to be rescheduled due to a freak power outage in the studio's neighborhood. When the actors finally reconvened, two of them, just for fun, read each other's lines in character, completely improvising the delivery. It was never meant to make it into the final cut, but when the director heard it, they decided to keep one of those swapped exchanges in a small background scene. It's subtle, almost imperceptible, unless you know what to listen for. But for those in the know, it's like a little wink from behind the curtain. The music department had their share of eccentric moments, too. One composer became so fascinated with a specific bird call they'd heard on that initial wildlife retreat that they insisted on weaving its rhythm into the background score. Not the sound itself, that would have been too obvious, but its pattern. To this day, even trained musicians have trouble spotting it, but once you do, you can't unhear it. It flutters through certain emotional peaks like a ghost from that trip. Of course, animation itself often comes with strange, unexpected challenges. For example, midway through production, the lighting team realized that the simulated sunlight in one of the key sequences was casting shadows in a direction that made no sense for the geography of the scene. Fixing it meant re-rendering an enormous amount of footage, a process so time-consuming that the crew began holding rendering parties, where they'd gather in a common room, watch the progress bars crawl forward, and entertain themselves with absurd, dramatic readings of the scene script. Some of those readings became so over the top that the voice actors were brought in just to hear them, and more than one bit of comedic timing in the final film was inspired by those late-night antics. And then there was the fox. Not in the script, an actual fox. For reasons no one could entirely explain, a lone fox started showing up outside the animation studio at odd hours. Security footage showed it pacing in front of the glass doors, peering in as if curious. Some of the staff began leaving snacks, probably against every workplace policy imaginable, and within weeks, the fox was making near-daily visits. Eventually, one animator worked it into a storyboard as an Easter egg, tucking a stylized version of the creature into the background of two scenes. No one outside the crew has officially confirmed its presence, but if you pause at just the right frames, you might spot a flash of red fur in places it shouldn't be. Voice acting days were often fertile ground for unusual moments. One actor, in the middle of recording a particularly emotional line, suddenly broke off, not because they forgot the words, but because they noticed one of the sound engineers silently crying in the booth. The whole room went still for a moment before they all started laughing, realizing that even in this polished, professional setting, the raw emotion of the story could catch someone completely off guard. That take stayed in the movie. The film's most controversial internal debate, surprisingly, had nothing to do with plot or character arcs. It was about the clouds. The art department had developed an elaborate system for simulating cloud movement that was so realistic. The director worried it might distract from the stylized world they'd built. Several meetings were devoted solely to cloud behavior, and in the end, they struck a compromise. The clouds would keep their natural physics, but be tinted with colors no real sky would have, creating a subtle surrealism. It's the kind of detail that you might not consciously register, but your brain feels it like a dream that's just a little too vivid. One of my favorite tidbits involves the soundtrack recording. The musicians were working on a piece that needed a warm, nostalgic tone, and during the lunch break, one violinist started playing a lullaby their grandmother had taught them. The composer overheard it, asked them to play again, and that little melody ended up woven into the emotional climax. No one outside the crew knows the origins of that tune, but for the musician, it's now immortalized, a private memory folded into the film's soul. Even the final stages of production weren't without oddity. When the team gathered for the wrap party, they set up a big screen to watch the finished cut together for the first time. But halfway through, the projector overheated and shut down. Instead of panicking, someone grabbed a guitar, others started acting out scenes, and by the time the projector was running again, they'd essentially lip-performed half the film for themselves. It became an impromptu tradition. Each year, on the anniversary of the wrap party, they get together to reenact one sequence from memory. And then there's a trivia that never made it into press kits, but lives on in whispered conversations between those who were there. A background character was modeled after a beloved coffee shop barista who kept the night shift animators caffeinated during crunch weeks. One animator quietly changed a small detail in a scene after a personal loss, turning it into a tribute only a handful of people will ever recognize. The sound of wind in one particularly tense scene isn't wind at all. It's a slowed-down recording of fabric being ripped, layered over itself dozens of times. All these little oddities, the fox, the swapped voices, the hidden lullaby, the clouds, are more than just production curiosities. They're proof that a film is a living thing before it ever reaches an audience. It's made up not only of scripts and schedules, but of human quirks, accidents, and moments of connection that no planning could replicate. When you watch the final product, you might not see every detail, but you can feel them. They're in the timing of a pause, the flicker of light on a character's face, the way a note lingers a fraction longer than expected. Sometimes the strangest facts aren't the ones that make headlines. They're the ones that stay tucked in the fabric of the movie, quiet and invisible, yet pulsing with the life of the people who made it. And in this case, those invisible threads might just be the thing that gives a story its rare, almost untraceable magic. Sometimes when I think back on the first time I experienced this film, it isn't a specific line of dialogue, or even one of its sweeping visual moments that comes to mind. It's the weight of certain events, how they pressed down on me, lingered, and reshaped my understanding of the story long after the credits rolled. That's how you know a film isn't just functioning as entertainment. It's operating on a level of myth, memory, and meditation. The events are crafted not only to move the plot forward, but to stir something old and universal inside us. The first significant turn happens early enough that you're still settling into the rhythm of the world, but it lands with a quiet inevitability. It's a scene that does what great stories often do. It destabilizes the comfort you think you have. From a purely structural perspective, this moment is a deliberate breach of narrative equilibrium. The characters, up until then, seem secure in a shared sense of purpose, and yet here comes an intrusion, one that feels like fate leaning in close to whisper, "You are not safe from change." The music in that moment doesn't swell in the way you might expect. Instead, it withdraws, as though the silence itself is a character standing in the room. It's a sound choice, no pun intended, that tells us something important about this movie's priorities. It trusts the audience to sit in discomfort. This early disruption sets the tone for how the film treats destiny. It's not some glowing prophecy handed down in perfect clarity. It's messy, tangled, wrapped up in conflicting loyalties and choices. And that messiness matters, because it frames the later turning points in a way that feels truer to life. Too often, cinematic big events come as thunderclaps of clarity. But here, even the most pivotal moments arrive wrapped in ambiguity. One such moment, and easily one of the most impactful, comes when a character makes a choice that's equal parts selfless and self-serving. From a plot standpoint, it's the hinge on which the entire story swings. From a thematic standpoint, it's a meditation on legacy and burden. Watching it unfold, I felt that strange ache you get when a character's decision resonates not because you make the same choice, but because you recognize it as something you might make on a different day, in a different version of your life. That's the secret power of well-handled moral ambiguity. It forces you into quiet self-reflection before you even realize it happened. The pacing of this film is another point where critical appreciation comes in. There are moments where the story allows itself to breathe, slowing down into near stillness. These aren't filler scenes. They're pressure points, moments where the emotional temperature of the film shifts almost imperceptibly. One in particular stands out. A simple exchange between two characters, framed against a backdrop so gorgeously rendered it could hang in a gallery. On paper, nothing big happens there, but cinematically, it's one of the most potent sequences because it crystallizes the film's underlying theme, that the bonds between individuals can be as defining as the grand battles they fight. And speaking of battles, yes, there are sequences here that are operatic in scope, where the sound and image swell to something almost overwhelming. But the film doesn't use these set pieces as blunt force spectacle. Instead, they're layered into the emotional architecture of the story. Every clash of wills, every sweeping movement across the landscape is tethered to a character's inner struggle. That's why, when the climactic confrontation finally comes, it doesn't just feel like a victory or defeat. It feels like a culmination of unspoken questions finally finding their voice. One of the cleverest and most quietly daring moves the story makes is in how it handles revelation. You're given pieces of truth in doses, often from unreliable narrators or through perspectives that are partial and skewed. By the time you think you've pieced it all together, the film flips something small, just a detail, a single line, a change in framing, and suddenly the whole meaning shifts. It's an approach that echoes oral storytelling traditions, where the truth is something you circle around, hearing different versions until your own sense of it crystallizes. I have to linger for a moment on the scene that, for me, serves as the emotional fulcrum of the entire film. It's not the loudest, nor the most visually spectacular. It's two characters speaking in the aftermath of loss. One is trying, in their way, to pass on wisdom. The other is barely able to hear it through the fog of grief. The writing here is economical, no wasted words, but the weight of what's unsaid hangs in the air like humidity before a storm. This is where the thematic resonance of the story deepens beyond its surface narrative about duty and destiny. This is where it begins speaking, more quietly but more insistently, about the ache of inheritance, what we're given, what we take, and what we wish we could refuse. Critically speaking, these moments are where the film's craftsmanship shines brightest. It's easy for big-budget spectacles to rely on technical brilliance alone, jaw-dropping animation, sweeping scores, precision editing. And this film certainly has all of that. But its true achievement lies in its willingness to slow down and let characters inhabit their feelings fully. It understands something that great literature often understands, that stillness can be as powerful as motion, that a single lingering shot can contain as much narrative force as a chase sequence. There's also an undercurrent of political allegory here, subtle enough to avoid feeling preachy, but present enough to be worth unpacking. Power in the story is never static. It shifts, often unpredictably, and those shifts reveal more about the characters than the initial possession of authority ever could. Watching the interplay of ambition, loyalty, and fear among the supporting cast is like watching a Shakespearean history play unfold in miniature. For viewers attuned to these currents, the film offers a rich secondary text running beneath the surface of its main plot. By the time the final act unfolds, the narrative threads have been pulled so taut that every choice feels consequential. There's a moment just before the resolution where everything hangs in suspension, not just the fate of the characters, but the moral center of a story. What's brilliant here is how the filmmakers resist the urge to wrap it all in neat absolutes. Victory comes, but it's tinged with loss. Justice is served, but only partially. It's this bittersweet layering that gives the ending its staying power. You don't leave with the clean catharsis of a fairy tale. You leave with something more complex, more human. And perhaps that's why this story resonates so deeply with me. I've always believed that the best narratives, whether told in prose on stage or through the luminous alchemy of cinema, are the ones that reflect life's contradictions back at us. We live in a world where joy and grief often share the same space, where triumphs are never pure and losses are rarely total. This film, in its best moments, captures that truth with a clarity that feels almost rare in modern storytelling. in terms of impact and reception. I think this dual commitment to spectacle and to emotional truth is what has allowed the film to connect across such a wide spectrum of viewers. For those coming in for visual grandeur, it delivers in spades. For those seeking thematic depth, it rewards close attention. And for those, like me, who find themselves somewhere between those poles, it offers that rarest of gifts, a story you can feel in your chest as much as you can admire with your eyes. Even now, thinking back on the key events, I find myself reliving the little details, a fleeting glance between characters that says more than a page of dialogue could, the way a motif in the score subtly changes key when a character's worldview shifts, the lingering image of horizon that seems to stretch endlessly, a visual metaphor for both possibility and burden. If I had to put it simply, which feels almost unfair to a story this layered, I'd say that the events of this film work because they are rooted in a deep understanding of consequence. Every major beat ripples outward, touching not just the main players, but the whole fabric of the world they inhabit. That's the kind of storytelling that doesn't just entertain. It stays with you, reshaping how you think about choice, fate, and the invisible threads that bind them. It's a strange thing, watching a film in the cinema, and then later discovering just how much of what you saw wasn't spontaneous or effortless as it looked. On the screen, the moments seem to happen in a perfect, inevitable order, as though the world of the story had always been there, waiting to be found. But behind that illusion lies a web of planning, compromise, experimentation, and sometimes plain happy accidents. This one was no exception. The first thing I learned when I began digging into the making of it was that the production was shaped by a sort of restlessness. The creative team didn't want to simply recreate the style or formula of what came before. They wanted something that could stand as its own creature. That meant months, no years, of conversations before a single frame was finalized. The animators in the story department treated the process almost like an archaeological dig. The idea wasn't to build a story so much as to find it buried in the layers of early drafts, sketches, and discarded experiments. What struck me most was how collaborative it all was. In an age when we tend to imagine films as the vision of a single tour, here was a project where the director was more of a conductor, guiding a vast orchestra of talent. Story artists would pitch sequences not just with static storyboard frames, but with rough animation set to temporary music, so everyone could feel the rhythm of a scene before it was even approved. It wasn't unusual for these pitches to be met with silence at first, not because they were bad, but because the room was collectively holding its breath, weighing whether a moment had that elusive quality that could make it timeless. One of my favorite behind-the-scenes stories came from a lighting artist who described spending 2 full weeks adjusting the exact shade of dusk in one pivotal scene. 2 weeks for a few minutes of screen time. Why? Because the director wanted that specific light to echo both a literal sunset and a symbolic one, a moment where something in the story was ending forever. The team experimented with colors from photographic references, African savanna sunsets, even old paintings, until they found a tone that conveyed both beauty and ache. That's the kind of obsessive detail you'd never notice consciously, but would feel instinctively. And then there were the voices. Recording sessions for animated films are often imagined as actors standing alone in sound booths, reading lines in isolation. But the crew here tried to break that mold. For certain key exchanges, they brought actors in together, not just for chemistry, but to capture the micro-pauses, overlaps, and half-finished sentences that happen in real conversations. One of the sound engineers laughed as he recalled having to sift through hours of unscripted banter, because some of the best emotional beats happened when the actors forgot they were being recorded. The music had its own rich story. The composer spoke about weaving familiar motifs into new arrangements, like threading old memories through fresh experiences. They experimented with instruments that could carry a certain ancestral weight, but still feel alive in a contemporary score. At one point, a scene was re-edited entirely to better fit a piece of music that had emerged organically in the scoring process. It was a reversal of the usual workflow, where music bends an image. Here, the image bent to music, and it worked because the tone was so inextricably linked to the narrative heartbeat. Of course, big productions also come with big challenges, and this one had its share. Early in development, there was a debate over how much the film should lean into realism versus stylization. Too realistic, and you risk losing the heightened emotional palette that animation can bring. too stylized, and you risk losing the weight and grandeur of the world. The eventual solution came from an unexpected place, a test scene that was never meant for the final cut. It was just a handful of seconds, wind in the grass, a silhouette moving across a ridge, but something about the balance in that shot convinced everyone they found the right visual language. That balance would guide the look of the entire film. Another fascinating tidbit. Some of the animal behaviors were lifted directly from wildlife documentaries, right down to the smallest gestures. There's a moment where a character tilts their head in curiosity, and that came from a field recording of an actual lion cub reacting to distant sound. The animator studied frame-by-frame footage to mimic the rhythm and hesitation in the movement. They joked that, in some ways, their best acting coach was nature itself. Not all behind-the-scenes stories are grand epiphanies, though. Sometimes they're just delightful accidents. In one instance, an animation glitch during a render test made a character's expression warp into something hilariously over the top. It had the crew in stitches, and while it didn't make it in the final cut, the spirit of that happy mistake inspired a later comedic beat. You'd never guess, watching it now, that its DNA came from a bug in the system. The production schedule was, predictably, a marathon. Animated features, especially ones with such layered visual and emotional ambitions, often take years from concept to final delivery. But the pace wasn't uniform. There were stretches of quiet, painstaking refinement followed by bursts of frantic activity when a sequence suddenly clicked and needed to be pushed to final animation quickly. One producer described it like farming. You plant seeds, storyboards, design concepts, rough cuts, tend to them patiently, and then one day, seemingly all at once, the field bursts into bloom, and everyone has to scramble to harvest before it fades. One of the more unusual occurrences came during a field research trip taken by part of the creative team. To capture the essence of the landscapes, they traveled to real savannas, deserts, and river valleys. At one point, a sudden rainstorm stranded them miles from their camp, forcing them to wait out under a rocky overhang. While they were there, they witnessed a herd of animals moving together in the distance, the kind of quiet, rhythmic procession that feels like a poem without words. That image stayed with them, and months later, it inspired one of the most quietly powerful scenes in the film. There's also a certain romance to the idea that even in such a tightly managed production, room is left for improvisation. A story artist once said that their most cherished moments on the job came from mistakes that tell the truth. In this case, a sequence that was supposed to be fast-paced and kinetic ended up being slowed down after an animator delivered a version that lingered longer than planned on a single, charged expression. Instead of correcting it, the director embraced the change, recognizing that the slower rhythm deepened the emotional impact. From a purely technical standpoint, the production was a playground for innovation. New rendering techniques allowed for richer textures in fur, dust, and water, details that give the world a tactile authenticity without distracting from the characters. The lighting team developed custom tools to mimic the way light scatters through dust particles at specific times of day. And here's the kicker. One of those tools was inspired by an old photograph found in a crew member's family album. The grain and warmth of the image became the baseline for an entire visual sequence. It's worth noting that for all the cutting-edge technology involved, much of the artistry still came down to human hands sketching on paper, sculpting with digital clay, or painting backgrounds frame by frame. The fusion of handcraft and technology was so seamless that you'd never notice where one ended and the other began. That, to me, is a hallmark of great animated filmmaking. It isn't about the tools, but about how those tools serve the story's soul. And perhaps my favorite little-known fact is that there's a moment, blink and you'll miss it, where the animators hit a tribute to a beloved colleague who passed away during production. It's subtle, woven into the environment in a way that feels organic, but for those who knew to look, it's a moving reminder of the human lives behind the art. That's the thing about films like this. They aren't just entertainment products. They're mosaics of personal histories, relationships, and memories. Thinking about all this now, I realize how much my appreciation for the film deepens when I see it as the product of hundreds of people's passion and persistence. Each decision, whether it's the angle of sunlight in a scene, the inflection in a line of dialogue, or the choice to leave a moment of silence unfilled, was a result of a conversation, an experiment, sometimes even a small argument. And that's part of what gives a finished work its layered richness. If you've ever stayed for the credits at the end of a movie like this, and I always do, you know that the list is long, sometimes hundreds of names. Behind each one is a story. Some were there from the first pitch meeting. Others joined midway through to solve a specific problem. Some were animators who lived with a single character for months, perfecting every nuance of movement. Some were researchers, poring over animal behavior videos late into the night. Some were composers and musicians who recorded in small, echoing rooms, hoping their work would someday swell through a cinema's speakers. All of them, in their own ways, left fingerprints on the final frame. And maybe that's the greatest fun fact of all. Not something you'll find in a press kit, but something you feel when you know how films like this are made. They are collective dreams, stitched together from countless small acts of imagination, discipline, and care. When you watch them, you're not just seeing a story unfold. You're catching a glimpse of the long, winding road that led there, full of detours, discoveries, and moments of unexpected beauty. When I think back to my first viewing of this film, the images that stay with me aren't just of the characters or the key dramatic moments. They're the spaces they inhabit. There's something about the way the settings are drawn, the way the landscapes seem to exhale between story beats. That makes the world feel as much a character as any lion or bird. It's a rare and precious thing in animation, to feel not just like you've been shown a place, but like you've been there. The first location we encounter is so expansive, it almost feels like an invitation. Rolling savannas stretch into the horizon, the air itself shimmering faintly with heat. The grass moves in slow waves, as though the earth is breathing beneath it. The animators didn't settle for a flat yellow-green palette here. They layered in ochres, dusty browns, and flashes of soft gold. So the land feels worn and lived in. When the wind brushes through, you can almost hear the distant rustle. I remember leaning forward in my seat at that moment, not because anything dramatic was happening, but because I wanted to step inside the frame. This openness is contrasted beautifully with moments of enclosure. The world isn't just vast plains. It's also deep ravines where sunlight filters in thin shafts, ancient rock formations pitted with shadows, and forests dense enough to muffle sound. There's a recurring sense that every place we see has a history, as though the stones themselves could tell stories if they chose. That feeling is one of the reasons I think the setting works so well. It never feels like a backdrop hastily thrown together. It feels like a land that existed long before we arrived, and will continue long after we leave. The filmmaker's attention to detail here borders on reverence. The research trips to real African landscapes clearly paid off, not just in accuracy, but in mood. There's a scene near a watering hole, for example, where the reflections in the water are slightly warped, just enough to suggest the movement of unseen creatures beneath the surface. It's the sort of detail you wouldn't consciously note in the moment, but it adds an undercurrent of life to the frame. One of my favorite sequences happens at dawn. The sky is painted with gradients so delicate they could be mistaken for watercolors. Pale pink melting into orange, then fading into the last traces of night. Here, the cinematography leans heavily into long, unhurried shots, allowing us to soak in the light before the day's events begin. That patience is rare in modern filmmaking, animated or otherwise, and it speaks to the confidence of the creative team. They trusted the audience to linger in stillness, to feel the slow unfurling of the world. The lighting throughout the film is nothing short of masterful. In bright, open scenes, there's a clarity that makes you squint, as though you're actually standing under a blazing sun. But in the quieter, more intimate moments, shadows wrap around the characters like blankets. The use of light and dark here isn't just visual, it's thematic. When the story dips into uncertainty or danger, the palette cools and the light thins, casting longer, more dramatic shadows. When hope or connection is at the forefront, the colors warm, even in small spaces. Cinematography and animation is its own unique magic trick. There's no actual camera, no physical lens position. But the filmmakers here mimic the logic and imperfection of real-world camera work to make the story feel grounded. Some shots have a slight handheld sway, as though a documentarian were following the action. Others use shallow focus, letting the foreground bloom in crisp clarity while the background melts into softness. That selective focus, when paired with the richness of the textures, draws your eye exactly where the directors wanted to go without ever feeling forced. Movement plays a huge role in how these settings breathe. On the savannah, the camera glides low over the grass before sweeping upward to reveal a distant horizon, mirroring the feeling of a bird taking flight. In moments of tension, the shots become tighter, almost claustrophobic, using the geography of cliffs, caves, or dense foliage to trap us alongside the characters. It's subtle, but the spatial design of the film plays with our emotions as surely as the music or dialogue. Speaking of music, the way sound interacts with setting here is remarkable. In open landscapes, you hear a faint delay in animal calls, as though they're echoing across miles. In enclosed spaces, every footstep and whisper seems amplified. This layering of environmental sound doesn't just add realism, it adds atmosphere. It's the difference between watching a place and feeling like you're standing in it. One scene that really stuck with me takes place during a storm. The animators captured not just the obvious things, the rain, the flashes of lightning, but the way the air itself feels heavy, the way the ground squelches underfoot after the first downpour. When lightning briefly illuminates the scene, you catch glimpses of the terrain in stark contrast, revealing hidden details you'd miss in daylight. The cinematography here plays a clever game with visibility, letting our imagination fill in the gaps the darkness conceals. I also love how the setting changes not just physically, but emotionally over the course of the story. Places we first encounter as safe and familiar can later feel ominous under different lighting or in a different emotional context. This shift mirrors the characters' journeys, how the same landscape can mean freedom one day and confinement the next. That's a deeply literary touch, and it's part of what makes the film resonate so strongly for those of us who love stories where setting is inseparable from theme. The attention to atmospheric detail extends even to transitional moments. When the story moves from one location to another, it often does so through natural phenomena, dust swirling in a gust of wind, a bird flying from one part of the savannah to another, or the changing patterns of light as clouds drift overhead. These transitions make the world feel cohesive and alive, as if we're witnessing a continuous reality rather than jumping between isolated set pieces. The climactic scenes push the setting to its extremes. Fire, wind, and shadow all play central roles, and the cinematography uses every trick. Low angles convey scale, silhouettes to heighten drama, rapid cuts to build tension, and then sudden stillness to let the weight of a moment sink in. It's breathtaking not just because of what's happening in the story, but because the environment itself seems to respond to the events, amplifying the emotional stakes. Even the smallest visual elements feel carefully considered. Patterns in rock faces echo the designs in certain characters' fur. The shapes of clouds mimic the curves of the landscape. The colors of the earth shift subtly depending on the time of day. None of this is done with a heavy hand. It's just there, waiting to be noticed, like secrets whisper between frames. I think what makes a setting so powerful is that they're not static. They change in response to both narrative and thematic beats. When the characters are united, the world feels expansive. When they're divided, it feels fractured. When they're hopeful, the air seems clearer. When they're in despair, dust and shadow dominate the frame. It's a symbiotic relationship between character and place, one that makes you believe the two are deeply intertwined. What's fascinating to me is how much of this magic comes from restraint. The filmmakers don't flood every frame with movement or detail. They know when to let negative space speak. In scenes of grief or contemplation, the backgrounds can be almost barren, with a muted color palette that gives the emotion room to resonate. It's a cinematic technique that echoes certain traditions in literature, where the absence of detail can be as powerful as its presence. In the end, I think the settings here work not because they're realistic in a photographic sense, but because they feel emotionally true. They reflect the inner states of the characters as much as the external world. That's something I've always admired in both great films and great novels. The ability to make a place feel like it has a soul, and let that soul evolve alongside the story. And maybe that's why, days after watching, I still find myself thinking about those open horizons, those shadowed caves, that soft golden light at dawn. They're not just images, they're memories. And like the best memories, they're tinged with the emotions I felt in the moment. Wonder, tension, loss, hope. That's the magic of a setting that's been truly lived in, not just drawn. There's a peculiar joy in peeling back the curtain on a film you've already fallen in love with. The magic is intact. But now you see the machinery, the countless human hands and minds working in unison to bring that magic to life. And with this particular film, learning about the behind-the-scenes process is almost as moving as watching the story itself. It's like finding out how your favorite symphony was composed and realizing every note, every rest, was placed there with deliberate care. The first thing that struck me, diving into the production stories, was how alive the creative process felt. This wasn't just a handful of people sketching characters at their desks. It was a sprawling collaboration involving artists, animators, musicians, voice actors, cultural consultants, and even wildlife experts, all speaking different languages of craft, but somehow harmonizing into one shared vision. And what fascinated me most was how many of the decisions we take for granted while watching were born from moments of pure serendipity. One of the most delightful stories I came across was about the film's opening sequence. The animators had been struggling for weeks to get the movement of the grass just right. Every test either looked too stiff or too chaotic. Then, during a video call with the animation leads in a satellite studio, someone's cat wandered into the frame, brushing past a potted plant and making the leaves sway in a perfectly irregular rhythm. That tiny, random movement became the reference point for the entire sequence. They actually nicknamed the effect Whiskers Mode in the animation files, a quiet nod to the feline muse who solved the problem. The voice recording sessions were another treasure trove of unexpected joy. Even though most actors recorded their lines separately due to scheduling and geographic constraints, the crew made a point to connect them in unconventional ways. One of the younger voice actors, recording from a home studio in another country, was sent small audio postcards from the rest of the cast, short recordings of encouragement or silly in-character greetings to make them feel included. The result? A performance that felt deeply connected, even though the actors weren't in the same room. It's one of those subtle acts of kindness that doesn't show up in the credits, but you can feel it in the energy of the film. But not every behind-the-scenes moment was a heartwarming accident. Some of the kind of near catastrophes that every film production faces, the ones that test a crew's patience and ingenuity. There was a particularly tense period late in production when the lighting system for one of the major set pieces simply wouldn't render properly. No matter what they tried, the simulated sunlight broke into harsh, unnatural bands across the scene. Weeks were slipping away, and the deadline loomed like a shadow on the savannah. The solution, oddly enough, came from one of the texture artists who had a side hobby in photography. They realized the problem wasn't in the rendering code, but in the virtual camera settings. By mimicking the aperture and lens flare patterns of an old analog camera, they were able to soften the light and give a far more natural glow. That tiny change saved the scene and became a subtle hallmark of the film's look, warm, almost nostalgic sunlight that feels as if it's passing through something tangible before hitting the ground. The crew's camaraderie during these moments is something that really stayed with me. In interviews, they talk about how they will hold digital campfires every Friday night during the long production months, video calls where everyone would log in, no matter their role, and share their favorite frame of the week. Sometimes it was a majestic, fully rendered shot. Other times it was a ridiculous work in progress with missing textures and floating eyes. It wasn't about perfection. It was about reminding each other why they were doing this in the first place. One of my favorite human touches came from the sound department. There's a particular scene where the rumble of distant thunder feels uncannily real, and there's a reason for that. It is real. The sound designer captured it during a late-night storm at their own home. They stepped outside with a recorder, raincoat half button, and waited for the right strike. The result was so atmospheric that it became the backbone of multiple storm scenes in the film. In the final mix, you can still hear the faint hiss of raindrops hitting leaves, an unplanned texture that makes the moment feel alive. The animation process itself was full of unusual experiments. For example, to perfect the way fur moved in different weather conditions, the team used actual animal fur samples in a wind tunnel, filming the results in slow motion. Watching those videos became a sort of meditative break for the animators, a reminder of the natural beauty they were trying to capture. It also led to a small in-joke. Whenever a render came out particularly well, someone would say, That's wind tunnel perfect, and everyone would know exactly what they meant. Of course, no big animated feature is without its challenges, and this one had its share. Midway through production, a software update unexpectedly broke several key tools the team had been relying on. Instead of panicking, the crew pulled together in a marathon problem-solving session, often working in shifts across time zones. It took nearly 2 weeks to rebuild their pipeline, but when they came out on the other side, the tools were faster and more efficient than before. They called it the Great Rebuild, and it became a badge of honor for anyone who had been there for those long nights. The interaction among the cast and crew, even across great distances, was one of the most endearing aspects of this production. There were private chat threads filled entirely with animal memes, voice actors sending short improvised recordings to each other in character, and an animator who quietly slipped subtle visual nods to their colleagues into background of certain scenes. In one frame, a pattern on a rock is actually based on the shape of a crewmate's favorite coffee mug. In another, a cloud formation echoes the silhouette of a director's beloved pet. These are the kind of Easter eggs that most viewers will never consciously notice, but they make the film feel personal. One surprising fact that delighted me: the film's musical team occasionally worked with the animation team in reverse order. Instead of scoring a finished scene, they would create a piece of music first. Then the animators would design the visuals to match the emotional beats of the score. It's a technique that requires immense trust between departments, but it resulted in some of the most harmonious moments in the film. Watching those scenes now, you can feel how perfectly the movement of the animation breathes in time with the rhythm of the music. There were also cultural consultants deeply involved from the earliest stages. Their insights went far beyond language accuracy or costume authenticity. They influenced how certain landscapes were portrayed, how ceremonies were framed, and even how silence was used in key scenes. One consultant told the team about a specific tradition of leaving certain pathways undisturbed in the grass, not for aesthetic reasons, but as a mark of respect for the spirits of the land. That detail made its way into film, subtly woven into the background of several shots. It's the kind of authenticity you can't fake, and it gives the world a quiet dignity. I can't forget the story about the team's first full cast and crew virtual screening of a nearly completed cut. They'd all been working in isolation for so long that most of them had never seen the sequences in full context. When the credits rolled, there was a long silence on the call. Not because anyone disliked it, but because they were too moved to speak. Then, slowly, people started unmuting, clapping, laughing, and sharing exact moments that had made them tear up. That shared vulnerability says more about the spirit of the project than any press release ever could. In the end, the making of this film seems to have been an act of collective care, not just the story they were telling, but for each other as human beings. They built rituals of connection in a process that can so easily become mechanical. They left pieces of themselves in the smallest corners of the frame. They turned technical challenges into opportunities for creativity. And I think that's why the final film feels the way it does. Like something that's been lived in and loved, not just manufactured. You can sense the laughter in the way characters move together, the late nights in the texture of the landscapes, the problem-solving triumphs in the way light falls on the horizon. It's a reminder that even in animation, where every pixel is carefully planned, the heart of the work comes from the unpredictable, human moments along the way. There's something about watching a story unfold that feels both ancient and deeply personal. Some films tap into that space inside us where myths live, where symbols, whether we notice them consciously or not, begin to stir old feelings. This film was one of those rare pieces of art that felt less like it was trying to tell me something new, and more like it was reminding me of truths I already knew but had forgotten. The beauty of it wasn't just in what happened, but in what it meant. From the opening frames, there's this unshakable sense of cycles, life repeating itself, not in a lazy way, but in a way that honors what came before while creating space for what is to come. That's where the first and most obvious theme emerges: the cycle of life. It's not just a poetic line from a song. It's the film's backbone. Everything in the story bends toward that idea, that existence isn't linear, that beginnings and endings feed each other like roots and branches. You can see it in the plot, in how triumph grows from tragedy, how loss births resilience, and how every character seems caught in a dance between what was and what will be. But the film doesn't treat the cycle of life as purely beautiful. It's honest about the messiness, too, the parts where cycles break or where they feel cruel. There are moments when the idea of inheriting the past feels like a burden instead of a blessing. Watching characters wrestle with that, I kept thinking about my own family. How some stories are told as sources of pride, while others are whispered about, reshaped, or avoided altogether. The film doesn't shy away from those shadowed inheritances. It makes space for the discomfort. This naturally folds into another theme that kept echoing in my mind: legacy. Here, legacy isn't just about thrones or titles. It's about the invisible threads that tie people together across time. Some characters carry it with honor, others try to outrun it, and some don't even know the full weight of what they've inherited. The symbolism for legacy is layered everywhere. The passing of certain talismans, the echo of old songs and new voices, the recurring visual of footprints in the sand slowly being filled by the next set of steps. One particular moment, a character pausing to step into the exact spot where an ancestor once stood, hit me harder than I expected. It's such a simple visual, but it's rich with meaning. And then there's a theme of leadership, what it costs, who deserves it, and what it even means. This isn't leadership painted in glossy heroism. It's shown as a constant act of balance. The film challenges the notion that leaders are born perfect or chosen by fate alone. Instead, it paints leadership as something earned and maintained through empathy, humility, and the willingness to put others above oneself. The symbolic imagery tied to leadership here is fascinating. Light and shadow falling differently across faces, the framing of a character at the top or bottom of a slope, even the way the camera lingers on hands, offering or withholding help. But perhaps my favorite recurring theme was that of identity, how it's shaped, fractured, and reclaimed. There are several points where characters confront versions of themselves they don't want to face. Sometimes this is visualized through mirrors of nature, a reflection in water rippling into distortion, or shadows stretching longer than their owners. One of the most striking symbolic moments is when a character walks through a field of tall grass, each step parting the stalks to reveal fleeting glimpses of their reflection in tiny dewdrops. It's a visual whisper of a question. Who are you when the world isn't watching? The natural world itself is one of the most potent symbols in the film. Water, for instance, becomes more than a backdrop. It's a language. Flowing rivers stand for change and movement. Still pools symbolize clarity and truth. And in one pivotal moment, a dry riverbed becomes the ultimate metaphor for absence, not just of water, but of guidance, of connection. When water finally returns to that riverbed later, the emotional release is as much about reconciliation as it is about survival. Light is another symbolic force the filmmakers wield with precision. Dawn and dusk aren't just pretty times of day. They're thresholds, moments when one state transforms into another. A sunrise often follows a revelation or renewed hope, while sunset marks moments of reflection or surrender. There's one scene in particular where light spills to the branches of a tree in such a way that it creates a crown-like silhouette above a character's head. It's never mentioned aloud, but the symbolism is unmistakable, and it's beautiful in its restraint. The animal imagery goes far beyond the obvious. Birds, for instance, frequently appear at moments of choice. Sometimes they scatter, symbolizing lost opportunity or the disruption of peace. Other times they fly together in tight formations, a visual nod to unity and shared purpose. In one quiet sequence, a single bird perches silently, watching from a distance, underscoring the isolation a character feels in that moment. The layers of meaning are endless if you're willing to look closely. Another powerful thread is the theme of destiny versus self-determination. The story toys with the question: are we bound to the paths laid before us, or can we carve our own way? This is explored not only in dialogue but in repeated symbolic imagery. Paths and roads appear throughout, sometimes winding into the distance, sometimes ending abruptly. Characters often pause at forks in the trail, framed in wide shots that make them look small against a vast landscape, reminding us how intimidating choice can be. Even the weather plays a role in the symbolism. Storms often arrive at moments of inner conflict, the sky a mirror of the turmoil below. Conversely, calm breezes seem to accompany clarity or reconciliation. There's one moment when a gust of wind sweeps through just as a character makes a silent decision to change course. It's so subtle, but it feels like the world itself is acknowledging the shift. There's also an unspoken but persistent theme of reconciliation, with others, with the past, with oneself. Forgiveness here isn't treated as a grand, single act. Instead, it's shown as a slow, often painful series of choices. Visually, this is mirrored in the recurring image of broken things being mended, not with invisible fixes, but with visible seams. A cracked ceremonial mask is repaired with golden resin, making the break part of its beauty. A torn banner is stitched together with mismatched thread. These details whisper a truth I've always believed. Our scars are part of our story, not blemishes to be hidden. What I found most moving, though, was how the themes don't sit in isolation. They weave together like a fabric. Legacy feeds into identity. Identity shapes leadership. Leadership demands reconciliation. Reconciliation allows the cycle of life to continue. It's all connected, and the symbols that carry these ideas are placed with such care that even the smallest ones, like the way shadows stretch differently depending on who is in frame, feel intentional. It's easy to watch a film like this and get caught up in the grandeur of it all, the sweeping landscapes, the powerful music, the moments of triumph. But for me, the real treasure is in these quieter undercurrents, the way the themes echo one another until they feel less like ideas in a story and more like truths about being human. This isn't just about lions and kingdoms. It's about all of us, how we live, how we lead, how we remember, how we forgive. And maybe that's why certain moments hit me so hard, because on some level, I recognize myself in them. I saw my own struggles with legacy in the hesitant steps of a character carrying more history than they wanted. I saw my own longing for identity in the searching gaze reflected in a still pool. I felt my own relief in the return of water to that dry riverbed. It's not just their story, it's ours, too. By the time the final moments arrive, the symbols have done their quiet work. We don't just understand the plot, we feel its weight. We've been walking beside these characters, watching them wrestle with the same invisible forces we wrestle with. And when the cycle turns again, when the next chapter begins, it doesn't feel like an ending. It feels like we've been reminded of something deep and true, that every step we take, every choice we make, becomes part of a much larger story, one that began long before us and will continue long after. There's a quiet sort of magic in noticing how a film is made, not just watching the story it tells, but paying attention to the little decisions behind the curtain that make that story breathe. When I sat down with this one, I promised myself I wouldn't just get swept away by the plot. I wanted to listen for the brushstrokes, to see the scaffolding behind the castle. And in doing that, I realized something. The way this movie is built is just as compelling as the story it tells. The first thing that struck me was the camera work, or perhaps I should say, the illusion of it. In an animated film, every movement of the camera is an act of deliberate artistry. There's no lucky shot, no coincidental lighting, no wind that just happened to blow at the right moment. Every tilt, every pan, every slow push-in is chosen with intent. Here, the filmmakers used this control to craft a sense of intimacy and scale at the same time. In quiet moments, the frame would seem to lean in, giving us a closeness to the characters that felt almost human. In grand moments, those sweeping landscapes, the layered horizons, they'd pull back, letting the vastness of the world wash over us. One of the cleverest touches was how the camera mimicked the imperfections of real-world cinematography. There are moments when it subtly refocuses, as if adjusting for movement. Other times it shakes slightly, not in a jarring way, but enough to make you forget this is all digital. It's a small thing, but it tricks the brain into feeling like we're seeing something captured rather than constructed. That, to me, is a hallmark of great animated filmmaking. The willingness to borrow the language of live action to make the illusion stronger. Lighting was its own kind of storytelling here. In this film, light isn't just about visibility. It's about emotion. Warm, golden tones wrap scenes of safety and connection, almost like a visual hug. Cooler, blue-gray hues dominate in moments of uncertainty or grief. And then there's shadow, used with such care that it becomes a character of its own. One particularly haunting scene places a character in near silhouette, the world around them still bright, as if to say, the darkness they're feeling is theirs alone, even in the light of day. I've always believed you can measure a film's craftsmanship by how it handles shadow, and this one passes that test with ease. Then there's the movement, not just of the camera, but of the world. The filmmakers seem to understand that nature is never still. Grass bends, water shimmers, leaves drift down in lazy spirals. These tiny, almost subconscious details make the setting feel alive, as though the world would keep moving even if we weren't watching. And because of that, we believe in it. Sound design here is another triumph. I don't mean just the music, though I'll get to that, but the way the world sounds. You can hear the grit under paws, the echo of a call across the plains, the subtle hum of insects in the distance. There's a layering to it, a richness that gives the impression of real space. One of my favorite choices was how certain moments pull the sound back, narrowing it to just one or two elements. It's like the world holds its breath alongside the characters. It's subtle, but it makes those moments stick in your chest. The music. Well, here's where I have to admit something. I'm a sucker for scores that weave themselves into the fabric of a film instead of sitting on top of it. That's exactly what happens here. Themes return, sometimes boldly, sometimes it's just a few quiet notes tucked in the background, like an old friend's voice from another room. There's a balance of grandeur and restraint, swelling orchestrations for the moment of triumph, stripped-down instrumentation for the private ones, and the integration of traditional African rhythms and instrumentation grounds the story in its world without ever feeling like set dressing. It's part of the film's heartbeat. Editing and animation is an art of rhythm as much as anything else. Here, the pacing feels organic, never so fast that you can't savor the imagery, never so slow that the energy fades. The transitions between scenes are often bridged by natural elements, a cloud passing, a bird taking flight, which keeps the story flowing like water. One sequence, in particular, transitions from a sunlit celebration to a tense confrontation by following the movement of a shadow across the ground. It's elegant, almost invisible, but it carries the emotional shift perfectly. I was also struck by the restraint in visual effects. Of course, in animation, the whole film is an effect in one sense, but there's a discipline here. They don't throw spectacle at us for its own sake. When the visuals explode into color or movement, it's because the story demands it. That means when the big moments arrive, they hit harder. You can feel the filmmakers holding back, letting the audience's anticipation build, before giving them that release. All of these techniques, the framing, the lighting, the sound, the editing, shape the film's atmosphere in ways that are hard to quantify but easy to feel. This is a world that feels lived in, not staged. Even in moments of fantasy or heightened drama, there's a weight to it, a sense of place. That's what makes the emotional beats land. We believe this world exists so the stakes feel real. Now, stepping back from the craft to talk about the box office side of things. I'll admit, I have a complicated relationship with numbers. They can tell us how a film performed, but they can't always tell us why it mattered. That said, this one did more than just pull in impressive figures. It stirred a conversation. From its opening weekend, the film drew both devoted fans of the original and new audiences curious about the prequel's promise. The marketing was savvy, leaning into the nostalgia while also showcasing the fresh visual style. Trailers teased familiar thematic beats, but with new emotional framing, enough to make even skeptical viewers curious. Social media buzz helped, of course, with clips and stills making the rounds weeks before release. And once the early reviews came in, many praising the depth of the storytelling and the richness of the visuals, that buzz turned into momentum. It's worth noting that animated films often have long legs at the box office, and this one was no exception. Word of mouth carried it well past the initial hype. Families came for spectacle, but repeat viewings were driven by those who found layers worth revisiting. The emotional resonance, the visual beauty, and the musical score became talking points in their own right. Financially, it surpassed expectations, particularly in international markets where the themes of legacy and identity resonated across cultural boundaries. It's fascinating to me how certain symbols, like the passing of light or the imagery of returning water, can mean slightly different things in different cultures, yet still carry the same emotional truth. That universality is part why it traveled so well. Of course, there's a temptation to frame its box office success as inevitable, After all, it's tied to a beloved legacy. But I think that underestimates the care taken in its making. Nostalgia may get people in the door, but it's craftsmanship that keeps them there, and it's heart that brings them back. This film had all three in balance. What lingers with me isn't just that it was successful, it's how it was successful. It didn't just ride the wave of brand name. It earned its place through thoughtful artistry and a clear respect for the audience. That's something not every film manages, no matter the budget or marketing push. And in the end, isn't that the real measure of production success? Not just the numbers on a ledger, but the way a film lodges itself in the cultural conversation, the way it invites people to talk about themes, symbols, and techniques like we're doing right now. The box office tells us it reached a lot of people. The ongoing discussions tell us it moved them. That's why, when I think about this film, I don't just remember the story it told. I remember the way it was told. The soft pull of the camera in moments of vulnerability. The warmth of the lighting in scenes of connection. The hush of the sound when the world seemed to pause. The seamless way each element worked with the others to create a world that felt as real as my own memories. And maybe that's the quiet magic of filmmaking at its best. It hides its labor so well that all you're left with is the feeling it gives you, until you go looking for the stitches and find that even those are beautiful. There's something strangely intimate about learning who gave their voice to the characters we've come to care about, especially in animation. With live action, we see the actors' faces, their movements, their gestures. But in animation, the connection is different. It's filtered through shape and color, yet somehow their essence still reaches us. That's why I always make time, after watching, to sink into cast interviews and behind-the-scenes clips. You start to notice the way a laugh in real life becomes a sparkle in a character's eye, or how an offhand comment in an interview reveals a choice that shaped an entire performance. The lead voice actors here brought something more than just talent. They brought a sense of reverence. You could feel it in the way they spoke about the project. There's one interview in particular I can't get out of my head. The actor behind the young, determined protagonist described spending hours listening to animal sounds. Not to imitate them, but to find the rhythm and breath patterns that would make their delivery feel grounded in the character's world. That kind of dedication is invisible in the final product, but it's part of what makes a performance so seamless. Another cast member, one of the veterans returning from the earlier films, shared a moment that caught me off guard. They talked about stepping into the recording booth and hearing, for the first time, the early animation render of a key emotional scene. Their voice cracked when they said, "I realized I had to match that beauty, that weight." It's humbling to think that even seasoned performers can feel that same rush of awe when they see the work of other artists in the team. One of my favorite things about animated productions is how the cast often records separately. Yet, when you hear the final product, it sounds as though they were right there in the same room. That magic comes from trust. Trust in the directors to guide the emotional beats. Trust in the other actors to match the energy. Trust in the story itself. In interviews, several cast members mentioned the same thing. They didn't just record lines. They had conversations. The director would set up a scene as if they were talking to a friend or an adversary, painting the context so vividly that the actors could respond naturally, even without a scene partner present. There were also lighter moments that make me smile just thinking about them. One actor, known for their ability to switch from comedy to drama in a single breath, admitted they had to do several takes of a particularly intense scene because the animation team kept sending back clips of the character blinking too slowly. Apparently, they laughed. I sounded like I was about to cry every time I paused. The beauty of animation is that it catches those micro-emotions, even in the voice, and translates them into visual details we might not consciously notice but still feel. Then there's the joy of hearing how cast members connect the story to their own lives. One performer described how the themes of legacy and mentorship reminded them of conversations they had with a grandparent. They even slipped a real family phrase into one line of dialogue, a small personal tribute, hidden in plain sight. Knowing that detail now makes me hear that moment differently. As for the director's interviews, they felt less like press tours and more like storytelling sessions. They spoke about the challenge of honoring the legacy of earlier films while creating something that could stand on its own. I remember them saying, the danger with a prequel is thinking the audience already knows where it ends, so you don't surprise them. But life isn't like that. We know the end of our own lives, but we're still surprised by the days in between. That stuck with me. It's the sort of insight that explains why this film feels alive rather than just inevitable. The collaborative spirit among the cast and crew seemed to be the film's quiet engine. In one roundtable interview, the sound designer told a story about adjusting the echo in a character's voice for a cavern scene, only to have the actor come back and re-record the line after hearing the change, because they felt inspired to lean into the moment more. That's the kind of back and forth that turns good work into great work. Now, shifting from the voices behind the screen to the voices in theater, audience reviews tell their own kind of story. On opening weekend, I found myself reading reactions late into the night, scrolling through comments and forum posts where people poured out their thoughts. It's always fascinating to see what sticks with people. Some latched onto specific lines of dialogue, the kind you see quoted over and over in social media captions. Others were floored by the visual artistry, pausing to describe scenes in almost painterly detail. A recurring theme in early reviews was emotional depth. People talk about being surprised at how much it moved them, even if they'd gone in expecting a lighter tone. One review I remember vividly came from someone who admitted they hadn't seen the original films. They went only because a friend insisted, and they left feeling like they'd been given a gift. "It made me want to call my dad," they wrote. That's the power of stories like this. They can reach into a life and stir something real. Of course, there were the big, sweeping praise pieces from established critics, but what I cherish are the smaller, personal accounts. Parents writing about the look on their child's face during a pivotal moment. Teenagers comparing the themes of self-discovery to their own struggles. Even a few older viewers recalling the first time they saw the original in theaters and marveling at how this new chapter managed to surprise them. Not every review was uncritical, and that's good. Thoughtful critiques help keep the conversation honest. Some viewers wish certain secondary characters had more screen time, or that a few plot points had been given more breathing room. But even in these critiques, there was a tone of engagement rather than dismissal. People wanted more because they'd been drawn in, not because they'd been left cold. Interestingly, international audience reactions brought out nuances I hadn't considered. In some cultures, certain visual metaphors, like the interplay of light and water, carry specific symbolic meanings that deepen the film's impact. Viewers from those backgrounds wrote about how these images resonated with traditions, myths, or personal memories. It reminded me that no matter how global a film aims to be, it will always find unique homes in different hearts. And then there were the joyous reactions. The people who left the theater buzzing, unable to stop talking. One viral post simply said, "My heart is full," accompanied by a blurry picture of the end credits. It wasn't a detailed review, but somehow it conveyed exactly what the film was meant to do. What I've noticed, looking at the arc of reactions, is that this film seems to linger. The initial wave of excitement is followed by quieter reflections days or weeks later. I read posts from people who went back for a second viewing and caught details they'd missed. The way a musical motif foreshadows a twist, or how a character's body language hints at a choice they'll make later. That's when you know a film has real staying power. When people aren't just consuming it, they're living with it. The cast seems to feel that resonance, too. In later interviews, after the premiere hype had settled, they spoke about receiving letters and messages from fans. Some shared artwork inspired by the film. Others recounted personal stories of how the themes touched them. You could hear the emotion in the actors' voices as they described these connections. One even admitted they'd printed out a particularly moving fan letter and kept it pinned above their desk as a reminder of why they do what they do. Looking back over all these threads, the cast's commitment, the director's vision, the audience's responses, it's clear that this isn't just a story that was told. It's a story that was shared. And in that sharing, it took on new life. The cast gave it their voices, the crew gave it their craft, and the audience gave it their hearts. That's the part I'll carry with me. Not just the film itself, but the chorus of voices it inspired, on both sides of the screen. It's strange how, after hours of pulling apart a film, unraveling its threads of story, its layers of symbolism, its carefully placed beats, you can find yourself sitting in a quiet moment, realizing you've been changed by it. Not in some loud, obvious way, but in the kind of quiet shift that makes you notice different things the next time you walk outside. That's where I find myself now, at the end of this long conversation we've been having together about this movie. When I first began this analysis, I didn't know exactly where it would take us. I had my notes, my thoughts, the mental bookmarks I'd made during my first watch. But like with any story worth telling, the journey surprised me. We started with introductions, with a kind of warm handshake between friends, because that's how I like to think of these moments, you and I here in this little corner of the internet, diving into something we both love for reasons that are both the same and entirely different. We move through the plot, piece by piece, not as critics dissecting a dead thing, but as travelers mapping the shape of a living landscape. I try to take you with me into the textures of the settings, the glances between characters, the rhythm of choices and consequences. We looked at the first sparks of conflict, the hidden foreshadowing, the moments when humor and heartbreak dance in the same breath. Then we reached the deeper waters, twists revealed, relationships tested, climaxes earned not through spectacle alone but through emotional weight. We saw characters grow in ways that felt both surprising and inevitable, like watching a flower bloom and realizing it's been preparing to do so all along. We lingered in the aftermath, in the way resolution doesn't always mean everything is neatly tied up, but rather that the story leaves you in a place where you can keep imagining. We didn't stop at the surface of the plot. We wandered into the realm of themes and symbols, tracing how ideas of legacy, courage, identity, and belonging threaded through everything. We noticed how certain visual motifs, shadows stretching across a savanna or light breaking through storm clouds, carried meanings that weren't announced but felt. And we talked about how these moments connect not just to the fictional world, but to ours, to the ways we carry our own histories and hopes. From there, we met the people behind the curtain. We listened to the voices of the cast, sometimes literally, in the case of those recorded interviews, and imagined them in sound booths, hands gesturing as they brought lines to life. We heard the director speak about balancing the weight of a beloved legacy with the freedom to create something new. We learned about the animators who worked on a single sequence for months, the sound designers who layered every echo and rustle to make us feel like we were truly there. We also invited the audience into our conversation. We read their reactions, some joyful, some tender, some thoughtful critiques that only made the work feel more alive. We discovered how different cultural contexts revealed new shades of meaning, and we saw how a story told in one place could ripple across the world in unexpected ways. And in between all of that, we paused for the odd, delightful facts, the behind-the-scenes mishaps, the unexpected inspirations, the tiny artistic choices that might have gone unnoticed if we hadn't stopped to shine a light on them. These moments, as much as the film itself, made me feel closer to the people who made it. They reminded me that movies are built not just from scripts and budgets, but from the fingerprints of every single person who touches them. Looking back, the thing I find most remarkable isn't just how much there is to say about a single film. It's how saying it together transforms the experience. Because yes, I could have sat here in a quiet room and written down my thoughts of myself, but sharing them with you changes the texture of the whole thing. It's like telling a story around a campfire. The glow comes not just from the flames, but from the fact that someone's sitting there with you, leaning in to listen. If I had to distill everything we've covered into one idea, it would be this. Stories, whether told on screen or whispered between friends, are bridges. They connect past and present, personal and universal, creator and audience. And this film, for all its grandeur and spectacle, is really a bridge built from the most human things: memory, longing, courage, and love. I think that's why it resonates so deeply. It isn't just a spectacle to watch once and forget. It's a story that asks you to bring your own life to it, to fill in the spaces between the lines with your own experiences, to hear echoes of your own voice and roars and whispers of its characters. And now, as we bring this analysis to a close, I want to thank you, not just for watching, but for engaging, for leaning in when the conversation got deep, for letting yourself imagine the smells and sound of the scenes, for carrying some of these moments with you after the screen went dark. That's what makes this more than just a video. It makes it a shared exploration. If you've enjoyed this journey, if it sparked ideas, stirred memories, or simply give you a richer way to think about movies, I hope you'll stay with me for the next one. Here in Cinema Vault, we don't just watch films. We live with them. We turn them over like stones in our hands. we look for the patterns in the grain. And there are so many more stones to turn together. So, if you haven't already, I warmly invite you to subscribe. Not in the cold, transactional way of a pop-up banner, but as a genuine invitation from someone who loves these conversations and wants to keep having them with you. Hit the little bell if you'd like to be there when the next story unfolds. Share this with a friend who gets just as lost in a movie as you do. And keep bringing your own insights, your own questions, your own stories, because that's what keeps this space alive. For now, I'll leave you with this thought. Every film we watch becomes a part of our own narrative. It slips into our minds, into our ways of seeing the world. Some stay quietly in the background. Others resurface at unexpected moments, reminding us of who we were when we first encountered them. This story we've explored together, feels like one I'll be carrying for a long time. Until next time, keep watching, keep feeling, and keep wondering. The vault is always open.